Hello and welcome to the Owl Hoot podcast with me, Caroline Norbury. In each episode, I chat to amazing guests with way more expertise than me on topics covering the environment and sustainability. You'll get to hear the facts on climate change, biodiversity loss and pollution, as well as discover the fabulous actions that individuals and organisations are doing to mitigate and adapt to our changing world. I don't know about you, but I find it reassuring and hopeful that there are so many capable people out there doing great things for our planet, as well as inspiring me to get on and do my bit too. So without further ado, let's get on with this week's episode. Here with me today is Natascha Radclyffe-Thomas, Professor of Marketing and Sustainable Business at the British School of Fashion, Vice Chair of the Costume Society and Editor-in-Chief for Bloomsbury Fashion Business Cases. Early on in her career, Natascha was partner to the award-winning luxury children's wear fashion label, Miss Fleur. Since becoming an academic, her research and teaching, covering topics such as sustainability, social enterprise, creativity, and consumer behaviour, has taken her across the continents of North America, Asia, and Europe. She has received numerous awards, including the National Teaching Fellowship Award, and co-authored the book Fashion Management: A Strategic Approach. It is with such great pleasure that I'm able to chat with Natascha this morning and share her expertise on sustainability within the fashion industry. So welcome, Natascha, to the podcast.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you so much for inviting me.
So I'd like to start with getting a bit of a feel for your career, how you sort of got interested in fashion and how you got interested in sustainability within the fashion model and business.
Great. Yeah, good question. I mean, I think for me, fashion's always been part of my life. I've used clothes to express my identity, to form, friendship groups. I was really interested, as a teenager, as many of us are, I was really interested in music. And I think fashion and music are really closely aligned and probably were more so when I was a teenager. And I found my love of fashion, I think, through making as well. So when I was younger, I couldn't find the clothes that I wanted to wear because I wanted to look like someone who'd stepped out of the 1960s, I think. And so I, used to forage for vintage clothes, but also for secondhand patterns. And I taught myself how to sew basically so I could wear the clothes that I wanted to wear. And then later on, I mean, I always was a maker from that point on, and I had a few sort of nascent little fashion businesses with friends and, market stalls and that kind of thing that other, that listeners may have done as well. I actually studied economics at university, but then after that, I really wanted to, I suppose, expand my knowledge of fashion. So I then went back and studied fashion part-time whilst being a sort of dressmaker designer. And then I think because I enjoyed my fashion education so much, I also then wanted to become a teacher. So I kind of had two parallel careers as a maker, as a designer, and then also as a fashion educator, which, I've been doing now for far too long than I care to remember, a really long time. And actually the sustainability piece really is, I would say, from the last 10 years or so of my career, because, increasingly we can't help but be aware of the negative impacts of fashion. So I came into fashion because I loved it and it was a personal way of me expressing creativity. But, especially I think in the period when I was living in Hong Kong, I became aware visibly in front of me, that the pollution from the fashion industry production in the south of China means that you can't see across Hong Kong harbour every day. People are displaced in terms of work. Industries like, heritage tailoring were being kind of decimated by mass production. And so in my personal experience, but also in the sort of areas that I was becoming more interested in academically, I started to really put a lens on fashion that was a more sustainable view. And that was really, I think, one of the tipping points. And then I kind of expanded and developed my interest since then.
So it's interesting what you say about being very visible in Hong Kong with the pollution. When did fashion, or has it always been perhaps polluting and less sustainable than we'd like it? I mean, I imagine it's been a bit of across history, it wasn't as unsustainable as it is currently. What happened?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question because we tend to think about fashion as being unsustainable as a kind of modern phenomenon. And to a certain degree, it is, for us that we really have experienced this ramping up of production and being more aware of the social and environmental impacts in the last few years. But if you think back to the sort of beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of the factories and the pollution that we experienced in the UK were textile factories, textile mills. So actually fashion and textiles, as much as they've had a real positive impact in terms of people's, creativity, in terms of developing industries and international trade in a positive sense, it's always sadly been quite an exploitative industry in terms of both people, and the environment. So I think sometimes it's hard to put those things sort of in context, but there has always been that. I think what's happened in the last 50 or so years is, for us in the UK, a lot of the production moved abroad. And so we weren't seeing that impact so directly. And what we were experiencing is a massive, people talk about democratization of fashion, because in the past, in maybe our grandmother's time, there wasn't easily accessible clothing that you could, run to the supermarket and pick up a T-shirt, or go online and have something delivered, within an hour. And people, had different relationships with clothes. On the main, people would have their Sunday best, and people would have their winter coat that they would hope would last for years and years. And we've just really got used to having very cheap, always available fashion. And you could say that at the beginning of that kind of model, that was quite liberating, because people, could dress up more, they could express themselves more. It was an expanding industry, but it's just, I suppose, tilted and tipped so far into unsustainable practices. And also they've become much more visible because of things like social media and because of fashion activism, which has been present all along, but has just got a lot more visibility recently.
Cool. That's a really nice overview of where we've come from and where we're at. In terms of the actual process then, which parts of in terms of getting your material and processing material and then selling it to different places in the consumer end, which parts of that sort of life cycle of the clothing is problematic, or maybe most problematic?
I was going to say, unfortunately, there are lots of problematic areas. But if we think about, I think one of the main impacts, and one of the things that people have started to really talk about a lot more recently, is that the process has been a linear system. It's been a kind of take, make and waste system. It's been a really extractive and exploitative system. So we've really taken for granted that materials are there, like cotton's there or polyester's there. We haven't thought too much about where they've come from and the impacts, along the way. One of the things that I became really aware of when I was living in Hong Kong, I attended a fashion conference, and I met the founder of Redress, which is a textile waste NGO operating, and they have the world's largest sustainable fashion design competition. And she really opened my eyes to this idea of pre-consumer textile waste, because we often don't really think about how much waste is built into systems. And, the idea that when, factories are producing garments, as much as they try to be efficient with the use of materials, there are all the offcuts, and then there are the extra samples, and then there's the overproduction. So there's such a lot of waste built into the system. And then similarly, working with them and with others, you become aware of the design decisions that people make are really, so important in terms of kind of designing that out. So I think looking at it a slightly different way, and I've been lucky enough to do some work with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and their whole idea is around circularity. And so that you design products for longevity, design things in a way that they can be used for longer, but you also think right back at the beginning of a design process, what materials are you using? Are they materials, that are extractive and are going to be, like if we think about single-use plastics or something, or are they materials that can, that are more, we can have more regenerative systems to support them? But then it's also, this is why it's so complicated. You think about materials, most of our clothing is made from either cotton or polyester. Now, polyester is basically plastics. And although we're having some developments in terms of things like polyester made from recycled, glasses and bottles and things, it's actually still plastic. So I think some people in the circular space would say, well, it's still, a waste. It's still, that's not going to biodegrade however many times, it gets processed. But also things like cotton, we've become really over-reliant on. And although it is debatable the extent to which how much water they use, etc., pesticides, they all have a negative impact. And I think in the last few years, the industry itself has realized that we can't just keep more and more and more and more. And so we have to look at those, choices of materials, but also the processes that go along with them. And then I would say one of the other things, and this is really wrapped up with fast fashion, is the global shipping. So whether things are being air freighted around the world, so that has a big impact. And then also actually, along with the fast fashion thing, I would say the returns. So lots of people have got used to shopping and maybe online and thinking, well, I'll buy 2 or 3, I'll see which one I like, I'll send it back, it doesn't matter. And that has a big kind of impact. And often those clothes don't get resold, they just get destroyed or go to landfill. But then also within even the retail space, if anyone's worked in retail, you'll be aware there's lots of things like lots of plastics in terms of packaging, coat hangers, shop fittings, many things that are not really sustainable there. And then when you take that garment home or you have it delivered to you, there's also how you use it and how you launder it. So there's big questions about, people have got used to washing things much more frequently because many of us have access to, washing machines at home. Lots of people might use tumble dryers. There's sort of energy usage as well. So I think, it's such a great question because there are so many different impacts, and this is what makes it so difficult. And that's why, certain groups of people in the sustainable space just say the most sustainable garments are the ones you already have. Don't get new ones because you've already got them, they exist already. Keep re-wearing what you've already got.
That's a great starting point, isn't it? Let's just stop shopping and that'll sort it. But obviously there will be times where people will want to buy new stuff, especially in the
well I'd say it is and it isn't, because the other thing is, as a maker myself, there's a certain degree to which designers want to create. It's part of the creative process, it's part of human activity. So there's that level of it. But there's also the fact that textiles and fashion is a big global business. And it's actually quite a low barrier business for emerging and developing economies. So many emerging and developing economies, work within the fashion and textiles sector because it is, there's demand there, and it's a way for people to industrialize and develop. It's not necessarily a problem that things are made, it's maybe the quantities, the techniques and the exploitation, because the social sustainability piece is about people being valued for their inputs and for their labor. And what I would say, again, the fashion industry has been really guilty of is maybe lauding the designers at one end, although maybe we've had a lot of conversations in fashion about people having too many demands on their creativity, but actually the people whose hands, and a lot of fashion is still, handmade, those people often are not seeing any of the rewards. So there's a lot of money in fashion. It's a big, multi-trillion-dollar business, but it's not fairly distributed. So so actually just say, well, let's stop shopping, which is what some people would advocate for, would obviously have knock-ons. And we saw that during the pandemic when factories closed down, when shops were closed, that there were a lot of people, primarily in countries like Bangladesh, who suddenly weren't being paid. Orders were cancelled by, Western brands, meaning that factories didn't have, they'd already invested in the materials, they couldn't pay, the factories closed. We have some of these things, I say, it becomes really complex, and I think it's really difficult as an individual to sort of navigate all of these different kind of choices when really a lot of them are systemic and they all kind of relate into each other.
Yeah, you cover quite nicely there the fact that it is so complex, and it isn't just about buying the right material or not buying, or it's so many parts of the process. And you also touch on the equity and the equality or inequality of the business itself across the world. So it just touches everything, doesn't it? I'm just going to pick out a few things that have been sort of raised there. One of which was the material, which obviously is not an easy choice either, from what you've said about it either being plastic or about being cotton, and perhaps that's uses a lot of water and a lot of resources. is there a better material if you are going to look for clothing? Where should your eye be drawn to?
Yeah, I mean, a great question. I think, what I've learned from speaking to a lot of people in the industry and a lot of different experts is actually one thing. If we think about circularity, so if we think of end of life first, what's going to happen to your garment? So is it a material that's suitable for the job? So if you are someone who's really outdoorsy and you're going hiking or you're doing performance sports, then you probably will go with some kind of a synthetic, because that may have the qualities. It might be lightweight, it can be wicking, you have lots of intelligent fibers, and that might be the right material for that. If you're having something just sort of for everyday wear, then probably going for natural fibers. But the main thing in terms of circularity and end of life is to have monofibers. So you have one fiber, because at the moment it's quite difficult. If we think about trying to recycle fabrics and textiles, it's quite difficult to do that when they're mixed. So actually having something that's 100% something is probably better there. And as I say, the reason that we have cotton and polyester is obviously because they are efficient. One of the things I think around polyester is long-term future, in terms of the fact that it's a byproduct of the sort of petrochemical industry. And so how much do we want to be reliant on that? And the fact that if you have clothing made from, polyester, it won't biodegrade at the moment. I mean, there are obviously technological developments that are helping with recycling of things, but it's not really there yet in any kind of scale. So we kind of want to think about those types of things. So I think it's really matching. I think what lots of people are trying to say now is maybe buy fewer things and buy better quality. But I do think this is where, governments and industry bodies have a role to play in helping us with those decisions and giving us that information. So if people are interested, there's several different sort of apps, things like the Good On You app that sort of rate fashion brands in terms of their sustainability across different areas, and that can kind of maybe help people. But I think one thing that's really interesting to think about in terms of materials is how we're trying to look to alternatives and maybe start to reintroduce fabrics like sort of linens and hemps that have been used in the past are actually quite sustainable, are very sustainable materials, can be grown close, if we're thinking about the UK, close to home. And I think it's really interesting that some projects about sort of relaunching those into the kind of fashion space, as well as having some kind of alternative materials, things, made from food waste and that type of thing. So some really interesting kind of developments in that kind of material space. But I think for many people, one of the things is we don't often have a choice, because if you go to your local high street or you go online, and I mean, you don't have the choice of what things are made of. So I think that's, one of the things where we really need to be pushing for brands and businesses to be supported to make the right decisions in the first place for us, and to help the consumer in that sense, and support, accessibility to more sustainable materials. But I mean, another thing I would say in that area is there seems to be a bit of a renaissance in clothes swapping, enjoying secondhand clothes, and in mending and things like that. So I mean, again, I think there are other choices for not buying new. And even within designer brands, we've seen people like Stella McCartney, when she helped develop the environmental profit and loss sort of accounting system within the Caring luxury group. And when they actually looked at the impact of their materials, they found that the cashmere wool had really such a high disproportionate impact. So then they made the decision to only use recycled cashmere in their collection. So I think things like that is like when you have the knowledge and information in a kind of audited, credible way, then it helps brands and businesses make those decisions kind of for us, so we don't have to have all of that responsibility. But I would say for a lot of people, and in my own research, a lot of people in the sustainability space actually don't mind what they buy, but they'll make different choices if they're buying it secondhand. So if they're in a charity store, okay, the thing already exists, you're not adding to that, you're keeping it out of landfill. So I think that's something to think as well. If you're buying from a charity store, then you've almost got a bit of a better golden ticket with your choices. The garments already exist, you're not supporting any kind of evil fashion empire that you don't want to, because it's going to charity.
Sure. A couple of things there. One being this last point about charity shops. I think it's very easy, isn't it, for people to think, oh, well, if I don't want my clothes, I'll just send them to charity shops. Maybe you can just highlight the issue with that premise of just sending it all to the charity shop.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that unfortunately, quite a significant number of people actually throw clothes in the bin, which I mean, I can't imagine, but they don't even go so far as to get into the charity store. But yes, I think one of the things that the pandemic showed us is the absolute volumes of stuff that people have, in certain parts of the world, and that they have disposable, they kind of consider them. And so lots of people did wardrobe clear outs and chucked it all off to the charity store, which became sort of overwhelmed. And so there are some really good programs with some of the charity stores where they promise that nothing will go to landfill. But in the past, a lot of, the things that we've cast off have been shipped off around the world. And that sort of continues to happen in certain parts of the world. And so then those local markets get overwhelmed with discarded goods, and that really undermines the ability for local clothing markets to kind of exist. And that's that's one of those externalities that we don't always think about. So you might think taking your batch of clothes off to the charity store is a really great thing that you're doing, and not really realizing that. So I mean, again, it's one of the things I guess about wearing your own thing. I think there's been a few people in this space talking about clearing out your life, only keep things that you love, and all of that type of thing, which has actually just led to lots of people chucking stuff out. I think interestingly with fashion, often if you don't change shape or size too much, you can reintroduce your own clothing into your wardrobe. Or I think there's kind of clothes swapping, and we've seen that as well, happening. There's actually apps that help you do that. If you have some great pieces in your wardrobe that you don't always want to wear, that you can actually rent out. So I think there's all sorts of interesting kind of developments in that kind of space. But the other thing I would say about charity stores is it's something, in London and in parts of the UK, we take for granted. But that kind of option doesn't exist, equally in all parts of the world. So I think, again, sometimes we think of things as a solution locally, but people don't always have access to that. I mean, I think that's one of the things that we're really gifted with in the UK is we have a really good kind of network of charity stores and people like Oxfam who, curate fashion collections and will, have pop-ups and are really promoting that. I think that's really great, but that's not happening everywhere.
I think the whole premise of bringing in that whole circular idea of keeping everything going is something to be mindful of, isn't it? And thinking about, it's a very similar story in lots of ways to how we buy just things in general, about our attitude to it is not dissimilar in lots of different industries. With the fashion in particular, it's so global. If you are going to purchase something high quality that you intend to sort of keep and reuse or share or whatever, does it matter if it's not made locally? I mean, I don't even know if it's that easy to buy clothes that are actually made in the UK. But should we be mindful of whether it says made in China or made in Taiwan or wherever it might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing, especially because I've done a lot of research about creativity in China, specifically, I think we often have these sort of badges where we assume a made in either implies good quality or bad quality. And what I would say in terms of the social sustainability is, we have sweatshops in the UK. So we know that we had the big boohoo kind of scandal in Leicester. So just associating a geographic location with an indicator of sustainability is not necessarily one that you can do, unfortunately. I think some of this, I mean, fashion is a really lovely, in a positive sense, can be a lovely global conversation. So I think it's really great. One of the things, I mean, I'm not really traveling at the moment, but when I've traveled in the past, I often like to buy fashion where I'm traveling. And that might actually be in a charity or a vintage store or a local designer, because it's something that will kind of encapsulate and you'll take it with you. And then when you wear that, I have a lovely big red woolen skirt I bought in Amsterdam when I was at a fashion conference. I bought it in a vintage store. And every time I wear that, I've got those associations. similar. I bought a beautiful pleated skirt when I was in Yunnan in southwest China, and that became my kind of conference skirt. And it's a real conversation starter. People often really admire the technique, and they're interested, is that South American? Is it, people are sort of guessing game of where that textile's from. So I think it would be a shame to say we're not allowed to have things from other parts of the world. But I think more the problem, I suppose, in the negative side of the globalization is that mass production, and that people have, I guess, taken advantage of different trade rules to then flood markets in other parts of the world. And I guess, again, it comes down to the value piece, doesn't it? And it's because labor has become is undervalued in different parts of the world, including in the UK, if we think about those kind of sweatshop things, that actually that's why lots of production happens around the world. And I think it's the shipping of high volumes of low quality goods that actually aren't necessarily going to get sold and might just go almost straight into landfill. And that's the question that really needs to be addressed. But I don't think personally that is an individual's responsibility. But I do think if it's something you're interested in, then by all means, look at some of these apps, and look at lots of businesses are making it much more what we call transparent about who they're working with, which factories they're supporting, because there's some great, sustainable factories in Asia, in Turkey, in different parts of the world. So, and I think if it's also garments that you're going to keep, wear multiple times and value, then you can that will offset all of those things across its lifetime. But I think what some companies are doing is, they're shipping by sea rather than air freight, and it's kind of building into this idea of slow fashion where you wait for things. It's not an immediate reward. You don't just sort of click and it's there. So I think that those are some things that we could think about as well.
I really like the fact that using the word value in many different ways, in terms of valuing the people that make your product, but also the items of clothing that you have or that you're going to purchase, that you have ascribed, rather than perhaps valuing it, this will look good once when I go to such and such, you're associating the value of it with this is where it was made, this is where I saw it, the whole journey of where you were at in your life and what other people say about it. That's the kind of value you're ascribing to your clothing, which I really, really like. I wonder, slightly going off at a bit of a different tack, in that because of your position of educating, you're a great spot to influence new people coming into the fashion industry. And as you say, it's not just about consumers making choices, and it's certainly not about just the designers having impact either. It's got to be societal, government, all manner of different levels. But from your own perspective, in terms of what you can do with your students, do they come in and are they awakened by your ideas on sustainability, or are they already coming in with the idea, I'm going to change the fashion business?
That's a great question. Now, I would say that's really changed in quite a short period of time. So I think, I know when I came back to London in 2012, I was asked to set up a new program in fashion marketing, and I wanted to thread sustainability through it. And even within the sort of educational space, there was a bit of pushback on that, because it was seen as a sort of bit of add-on, or well, here's a module, or here's one guest speaker who will come in and talk about sustainability. It's this very niche area. And I think part of that was because of the complexity, and people didn't really understand it. And I think as well at that time, a lot of the conversation was about materials and environment. And although I've worked as a designer, latterly the education space I've worked in is more fashion business and marketing. And so even from the, education institutions themselves weren't really super keen on that being more than a niche area. But what I did see very shortly, after launching that program, which started in 2014, that actually students coming onto the program, they didn't necessarily talk about sustainability in that term, but they talked about aspirations to change the world. And it was a really interesting switch, because previously to that, if you'd ask students what their aspirations were, which you often do at the beginning of a program, they might say, well, I want to work for Chanel. Now, I'm not saying that that's changed and people do still want to work for Chanel, but they were starting to say, I want to help people, I want to educate people. And it was a sort of a bit of an ambiguous, but it was really, amazing and delightful to see. Now, at that point, I started a sustainability sort of elective, and the first cohort was very small because not so many students were interested in it. But over each year, that number grew and grew. And I think now we're seeing that that's the number one topic that students, not just within fashion, but lots of students are really interested in this. And I think because fashion is something that touches all of our lives, it's quite an accessible subject. And also, I think because people like Fashion Revolution have been so successful with their communications of bringing this to people's attention, I think it's definitely an area that people want to get involved in. So, when I started work at the British School of Fashion, where I am now, I was brought in to amongst other things, to develop a module in sustainable luxury. But I think students across the piece find this area so fascinating. And I think what's been great is to see how, when you introduce some of these areas of environmental and social impact, how students can recognize these very quickly. So I was working last week with a group of students. We were talking about a social enterprise called Tengri, who I'm very interested in. I've done some research about. They were founded by a social worker who went to Mongolia and was, I suppose, really depressed by the level of poverty of the yak herders and wanted to do something positive to impact their lives. So she created a luxury brand with a luxury fibre, Yakshmere, which is the yak fibre. It's a fascinating story. We were looking at that as a case study. And the students really recognised all of the sort of, I suppose, influences and impacts within that in quite a sophisticated way and could relate that to their own lives. And I think increasingly we're seeing, I mean, not just from my own anecdotal experience, but we're seeing from the research that especially younger people, but also sort of mid-career, people are wanting to work with purpose. Now, they might define that in different ways, but they're kind of scrutinising fashion businesses in different ways, and they're asking questions, whether that be about gender pay gaps, whether that be about cultural appropriation, whether that be about diversity behind the camera as well as in front of it. So I think it's really pleasing to see how this kind of level of personal activism is actually coming from students themselves. And I think that's what's so fascinating, because sometimes people say, well, what does it matter what students think, because they're not going to have that much influence. But I've always thought of our students as integral to the industry. They're young fashion professionals. And I've always worked to try and empower people to understand, that they will have the opportunity to make choices and that they can make informed choices. So the idea of kind of, education around sustainability is not to tell people what to do, but it is to empower people with enough information and the curiosity, and to also challenge and ask questions. So when we launched the sustainable, luxury module, some of the things we were thinking about is why and what if. So I think that's a really interesting space for students to be in.
I like that a lot, because I think getting curious about it is the way of discovery, isn't it? And finding that their own route through where they want to go, but also being, as you say, if they've got the information, they can make informed choices through that sort of curiosity and extension of their knowledge. What are your hopes within your current role that you hope to achieve in the future?
I think we're already, that's a great question, and thank you. I think I'm already seeing the fruits of that. I think just engaging even, with a small cohort of students that we have on our MBA luxury brand management program, just seeing how they've really picked up and run with this. One of the really interesting, we're based in London. It's a really multicultural city, as you know, and we have students from all parts of the world. And one of the aspects that I'm particularly interested in is these sort of cultural heritage aspects of sustainability. And it's been really interesting. The last cohort of dissertation students, many of them looked at sustainability, what the impacts were and what it could mean, in their home countries. And that's really interesting for me. So I'd really like that to be expanded so that our understandings of sustainability are more nuanced, that we understand that people have, we have similar but also different cultural practices and understandings, and that we really empower people to work within their own communities to shape the sustainability agenda. So it's not something that's being kind of placed on people, but it's something that people are part of. And that's the reason I like working, or I really love working in sustainable fashion, is a very collaborative community space. And I think that's one of the things, that I'm happier than anything. I think if we're bringing our students and young professionals to be part of that, and that they're the advocates, and that they're the change makers. So I think that's sort of one of my hopes. And I think we're seeing that enacted. And I think a lot of brands and businesses, whether it's cynical or whether it's heartfelt, have actually recognised that they need to listen to the voices of younger people and to empower them if we're going to kind of solve all of these huge challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you spoke that very well, in that companies will want to be seen to be doing something, even if they're not quite at the point of actually doing something really, really good yet. They're certainly wanting to be seen to be doing.
Yeah, and I mean, that can
good.
be problematic, and we can talk about things like greenwashing and be cynical, but I think whatever the motivation is, if people are being pushed, if governments, organisations are being pushed to that and to be responsive to these questions, then I think ultimately we have positive outcomes.
Yeah. So how then do you see 2050, 30 odd years, just under 30 years away? Do you think we'll be in a much better, if that's the right word, landscape in terms of the fashion business?
Yeah, I mean, again, a really interesting question. I think there's two ways we could go. We could be really pessimistic and cynical and say, we're at a highway to disaster. We have so many problems and they're insurmountable. And if we don't act, we've got the climate change, obviously, being this huge sort of impact that fashion industry contributes to. But I'd also say that fashion is reflective of culture. And so I think if we see these sort of movements to more positive understandings with the right support, I think fashion could be, I'd really love it if fashion could go back to what it was. I guess when I was younger, maybe I was naive, but it was more of the glamour and the appreciation of the creativity. And it was less about the exploitative practices. I think we're well aware of those now, and it just takes collective action to deal with them. I think fashion is a really hugely creative space. It's also not one thing. I mean, it's a massive industry with lots of operations. So I would like to see from the positive side that with a lot of energy going into it, that we're in a much better space and we can be celebrating creativity and sort of global cooperation in a fashion space, as opposed to counting up its many problems and impacts. That would be my hope.
Yes, I hope that too. And I wonder, just as an add-on to that, you've made me wonder, I always think of fashion being driven by young people, and that may be just my own perception. If that is the case, maybe that's more hopeful, because obviously it's their futures at stake. Is that just am I just imagining that it's young people driving fashion?
Well, I think fashion has a youth obsession, and that has to be recognized. But I also, as I alluded to, fashion is not one thing. And I think I was invited to speak at a menopause cafe a couple of weeks ago about fashion and women in the menopause. And at the start of our conversation, I was talking about how fashion is about identity. And I think there's a lot of space for fashion to help people celebrate their lives and identities at all different ages. And I think that's one of the things recently. And I think social media, one of its positives maybe, has been to give people at all different ages and styles spaces to express themselves. So people who don't work in fashion but have interesting styles can share those. People can look and search for inspiration and celebrate that. So I think it's actually it can reach out across all ages. But we have been in a period where youth has been particularly celebrated in certain parts of the media, and we definitely have focused on that. And I guess that's a natural kind of cycle. But I actually think fashion should be for everyone in a positive way.
Excellent. I'm glad you said that, actually, as a midlife woman. So finally, Natascha, I wonder what, if any, changes you've made as you came into sort of more of a sustainability angle. Did it change things in your own life, whether it be fashion or otherwise?
Yeah, I think for me personally, understanding more about sustainability, I've recognized that some of my habits, behaviors and likes have been sustainable without me naming them that. And I think probably, listeners will recognize that as well. So, I like making things. I've always actually liked preparing things. I thrifted and bought things secondhand. So those sort of behaviors when I was doing them. I wasn't thinking of it specific as being sustainable. But I think the biggest change has really been about advocating, for sustainability within the education space, because that is my sphere of influence, and understanding these more nuanced ways, and especially I think pushing that social side of sustainability and the kind of cultural side. So I think the changes I've made there may be other things that I shine a light on. I always try to be positive, and I've tried to showcase brands, businesses and practices that are doing good in fashion, because ultimately I really do believe in fashion as a positive force. I think recently maybe I would think more about purchasing. I think definitely the thought process, you can't ignore that, because you want to be able to sort of walk the walk yourself. You don't want it just to be a purely academic endeavor, and I think that can be challenging, and I think that helps you also understand the challenges that other people have, and recognize maybe the privileged position you can be in with this, and I think that recognizing those complexities, but I'm sure some of this spills over into sort of friends and people who observe what I'm wearing, in the wider world, and ask about it, and that leads to conversations. So I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely did. No, spot on. Yeah,
Great.
That was a nice broad approach to that answer. So thank you very much. It's been really interesting, Natascha, hearing about what is a very complex topic. So thanks for engaging with me on that today.
You're really welcome. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
A conversation about sustainability in fashion could have been quite a miserable one when you consider pollution, clothing waste and poor working conditions. Natascha, however, managed to leave me feeling upbeat about a more circular system for clothing and content with my existing wardrobe. What struck me in particular was valuing clothing items for how they come into your possession, how they make you feel and the connections to memories they offer, rather than just referencing them to one single night out. To find out more about Natascha, see the links in the show notes. I'd like to thank Andy Shaw for audio editing, Jeremy Jones for providing the music, and to you for listening. If you want to hear more stories of people doing great things that positively impact our environment, check out my previous conversations or click subscribe for future ones. Please do rate, review and share the podcast too. It really helps others find it. Until next time, bye for now.